John Lewis Gaddis, often referred to as the Dean of Cold War historians, presents the Cold War: A New History as a lucid, comprehensive, and accessible interpretation of one of the most defining periods of the 20th century. Published in 2005, this book is not intended to be a dense academic tome, but rather a synthesis of decades of scholarship, updated with post-Cold War revelations, and written for a general audience. Gaddis offers a compelling narrative that captures both the ideological rigidity and the human drama of the Cold War, illustrating how power, personalities, and politics shaped global events for nearly half a century. The nature of the Cold War. Gaddis begins by defining the Cold War not simply as a geopolitical rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, but as a global ideological struggle between two incompatible visions of modernity. On one side stood the liberal capitalist democracy of the West, centered around the United States. On the other, the totalitarian communist model of the Soviet Union, aspiring to reshape the world in its image. The Cold War, then, was not a traditional war fought with armies and battles, but rather a protracted, tense, and dangerous competition that manifested through proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, arms races, and diplomacy. Despite the immense potential for destruction, especially with nuclear weapons in play, the Cold War remained cold in the sense that it never escalated into direct, large-scale war between the two superpowers. Gaddis credits this relative stability to the development of deterrence strategies, the presence of mutual fear, and even a kind of moral clarity that defined the period. Ideology and origins. The origins of the Cold War, Gaddis argues, can be traced to the collapse of the wartime alliance against Nazi Germany. While both the US and the USSR had cooperated to defeat fascism, they had fundamentally different visions for the post-war world. The Americans, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt and later Harry Truman, championed democracy and free markets. The Soviets, led by Joseph Stalin, pursued a vision of global communism and consolidated control over Eastern Europe through coercion and the establishment of satellite states. Gaddis points out that the Cold War did not arise out of mutual misunderstanding alone. It was deeply rooted in the character of the Soviet regime and the expansionist tendencies of Stalin's totalitarianism. He shows that US leaders, who initially hoped for post-war cooperation, gradually hardened their stance as it became evident that Stalin intended to dominate Eastern Europe. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 and the Marshall Plan were American responses to perceived Soviet aggression, setting the tone for decades of confrontation. Containment and confrontation. One of the central strategies of the United States during the Cold War was containment, first articulated by diplomat George F. Kennan. The idea was to prevent the spread of communism through strategic alliances, economic aid, and military deterrence. Gaddis explores how this strategy evolved over time and was applied inconsistently. While it sometimes succeeded in stabilizing regions, as in Western Europe, at other times it led to costly entanglements, notably in Vietnam. Gaddis devotes considerable attention to key crises and turning points in the Cold War, including the Berlin blockade, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Vietnam War. He emphasizes that the Cold War was not simply a story of superpower posturing, but had real consequences for millions around the globe. Proxy wars in Asia, Africa, and Latin America brought suffering to many and revealed the limits of American and Soviet influence alike. The human element. A unique strength of the Cold War: A New History is Gaddis's focus on the role of individuals. He argues that personal leadership mattered immensely in shaping the course of events. Figures like Stalin, Truman, Mao Zedong, Khrushchev, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, and Mikhail Gorbachev each brought distinct personalities, ideologies, and leadership styles to the Cold War arena. Gaddis portrays Stalin as ruthlessly paranoid and inflexible, and his death in 1953 opened new opportunities for diplomacy and change. Khrushchev's unpredictable mix of bluster and reformist rhetoric led to both thaw and tension, most dramatically during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Meanwhile, Reagan's strong anti-communist rhetoric, coupled with his later willingness to negotiate, challenged the Soviet regime in unprecedented ways. Perhaps most importantly, Gaddis highlights Gorbachev as the pivotal figure in ending the Cold War. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev was not willing to use violence to maintain the Soviet Empire, and his reforms, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, unintentionally unraveled the Soviet system. Gaddis credits Gorbachev's moral courage and vision with helping to bring about a peaceful end to decades of hostility. The role of nuclear weapons. One of the paradoxes of the Cold War, as Gaddis notes, was that nuclear weapons, while terrifying and potentially apocalyptic, may have actually helped prevent war. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, meant that neither side could launch a nuclear attack without ensuring its own destruction. This grim logic created a kind of stability, even as it fostered anxiety and led to massive arms spending. Gaddis examines how both the US and the USSR managed this nuclear standoff, particularly during crises such as the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The fact that this crisis ended in compromise and communication rather than catastrophe, he argues, shows that deterrence and diplomacy often went hand in hand. End of the Cold War. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, or more accurately, with a combination of economic exhaustion, political reform, and popular uprising. Gaddis explains how by the 1980s the Soviet system was stagnating economically and ideologically. The United States, under Reagan, increased pressure through defense spending and rhetorical offensives against the evil empire. Yet it was the internal weaknesses of the Soviet Union and the courage of reformers like Gorbachev that ultimately brought about the end. The revolutions of 1989, in which communist regimes across Eastern Europe fell one after another, marked the symbolic and literal collapse of Soviet influence. The reunification of Germany, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, and finally the breakup of the Soviet Union itself in 1991, signaled the end of the Cold War. Gaddis sees this outcome as a vindication of liberal democracy and a repudiation of totalitarianism. Reflections and legacy. In his concluding chapters, Gaddis reflects on what the Cold War teaches us about power, ideology, and international relations. He suggests that the Cold War, despite its dangers, produced a kind of global order and stability that has been difficult to replicate in the post-Cold War era. The absence of great power war, the spread of democracy, and the avoidance of nuclear catastrophe were significant achievements. However, Gaddis also warns against triumphalism. The Cold War may have ended, but the challenges of power politics, ideological extremism, and global inequality remain. He encourages readers to view the Cold War not simply as a chapter that is closed, but as a period that still offers valuable lessons for the present and future. Conclusion: The Cold War, A New History by John Lewis Gaddis is an essential read for anyone seeking to understand the complexities of the 20th century. Through clear prose, engaging storytelling, and insightful analysis, Gaddis illuminates the grand strategies, key events, and personal dramas that defined the Cold War era. His book not only recounts history, but invites readers to think critically about the nature of conflict, the role of leadership, and the choices that shape our world. By offering both clarity and nuance, Gaddis helps a new generation comprehend the legacy of a war that was never declared, but profoundly changed the world.